The galaxy was in trouble, and no one could ignore it anymore. For years, the Council of Concord had tried to keep peace between the different species. They had worked to form alliances, create trade routes, and avoid war. But there was a new enemy in the galaxy, the Xrethul. At first, they seemed like just another threat. The Xrethul were an insect-like species, huge and strong, with sharp claws and armored bodies that could withstand most weapons. But the Council quickly learned that the Xrethul weren't just strong, they were unstoppable. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when the Xrethul attacked the planet Scree. A peaceful world, home to the soft-spoken Nuvorians, had sent a distress signal. By the time the Council sent their fleet, the planet had already been wiped out. Not just destroyed, consumed. The Xrethul didn't just kill their enemies. They took over the worlds they conquered, using the resources and living things for themselves. Their armies grew larger with each planet they destroyed. The next attack came on the system of Volturnine. The Council had been warned this time, but even their best fleets couldn't stop the swarm of Xrethul warriors. They had advanced weapons, but the Xrethul didn't care. They attacked without fear, tearing apart every defense the Council threw at them. The fleets scattered. Whole planets fell in days. The Council was afraid. The greatest military powers in the galaxy, species that had been fighting wars for centuries, were being destroyed. Every battle ended in failure. For the first time in decades, the Council didn't know what to do. They needed help, and they needed it fast. It was then that they decided to send a message. The message wasn't meant for the galaxy's greatest leaders, scientists, or diplomats. They didn't need more talks or strategies. What they needed were warriors, tough, ruthless fighters who could face the Xrethul head-on. They needed people who weren't afraid to bleed, to break, and to kill when the situation demanded it. That's when the message went out across the galaxy. The Xrethul have broken our fleets. They consume worlds faster than we can evacuate. If you hear this, send warriors. Send your best. As the message bounced across the stars, the Council had little hope. Who would answer? The galaxy was full of powerful species, but most of them were more interested in trade, peace, or keeping to themselves. Few were willing to risk everything for a war that might not even be winnable. On Earth, though, something was different. Humanity had always been seen as weak. They were a young species, barely out of their own solar system, and certainly not well known across the galaxy. The Council's database on humans was sparse. Their technology was primitive compared to the advanced species in the galaxy. Their soldiers, at first glance, didn't seem particularly impressive. Humans weren't big or strong like the Trelax, nor were they mind readers like the Dravket. They didn't have the natural claws of the Xrethul or the swarming hives of the Zarnak. No, humans were just regular people, but they had something that made them different from everyone else. They had a history of survival. Earth had been through wars, hunger, disease, and disasters, but every time they were knocked down, humans stood back up. And when they stood, they fought back harder. The idea of giving up wasn't in their vocabulary. That's what made humans dangerous. When the Council's call came in, it was sent straight to Earth's most secretive and dangerous military channels. These were the places where the most dangerous individuals in humanity's history were kept. Mercenaries, assassins, survivalists, soldiers who didn't care about rules, but only about winning. The blacklist was activated. The blacklist wasn't a list of names that were spoken in public. These were the names of people too dangerous, too violent for regular society. They were people who had been left alone in the shadows. The world's leaders knew they existed but didn't talk about them. Some had been imprisoned for their actions. Others had simply gone rogue, taking jobs that no one else would do. Their skills were unique, deadly, in fact. But the truth was that humanity had learned to control their wildest elements. And now, with the galaxy's survival at stake, the blacklist was their only hope. Once the blacklist was activated, names began to surface. Names of soldiers who had survived battles others had called impossible. These were men and women who had fought wars on planets far from Earth, using nothing but their wits, their weapons, and their will to survive. It was a short list, but it was the best humanity had. The Council wasn't expecting much when the Terran, human, ship arrived in orbit. They didn't expect Earth's best to be anything more than a few oddballs. They didn't realize how wrong they were. The Council didn't know what to expect when the Terran ship arrived at their high-orbit station. They had seen human ships before, small, often old, and not very impressive compared to the huge, sleek vessels of the galactic powers. What arrived from Earth, however, was different. The ship wasn't anything special at first glance. It was a rusted old freighter, a far cry from the polished military ships the Trilaks or Dravket would send into battle. Its hull was dented, patched up in places with what looked like hastily applied metal plates, but there was something about it that felt alive. The humans weren't here for glory or honor. They were here because they knew how to get things done. As the freighter docked, a series of heavy, slow hisses echoed through the station. The airlock opened, and a group of humans stepped out, one by one, onto the platform where the Council representatives stood waiting. At first, the Council's members exchanged uncertain glances. They had expected more from Earth's response. Maybe grand uniforms or ceremonial weapons. What they saw, instead, were humans dressed in simple gear, battle-worn and grim. The first to step forward was a tall woman with a cold, calculating look in her eyes. Her hair was dark, cropped short, and her face was sharp, hardened by years of experience. She didn't look like a diplomat, and she certainly didn't look like a politician. She looked like someone who had seen enough death to know how to deal with it. Her name was Captain Valeria Kane, and she wasn't here to make friends. The Council members stood still, watching as she approached them. They couldn't help but notice the lack of any obvious weapon on her. No sword, no blaster. Just a sleek black exosuit that seemed more like armor than clothing. And yet, there was a confidence about her that made even the towering, multi-eyed Trilaks generals feel uneasy. "Welcome, Captain Kane," one of the Council representatives, a Dravket strategist, said, trying to hide his nervousness. "We're grateful for your arrival. We were hoping." "We're not here to talk," Captain Kane interrupted. Her voice was steady, firm, and had a strange way of commanding attention. "We're here to end the Trethul. And we don't need your gratitude, your medals, or your speeches." The room fell silent. There was no anger in her tone, only truth. The humans had no interest in parading themselves as heroes. They were there to fight. They had heard the call, and they knew exactly what they needed to do. Behind her, the rest of the human crew entered the room, each one just as fierce and focused as she was. Alexei Ghost Markov was the next to step forward. His movements were fluid, almost ghostly, like a predator in the night. He was tall, but not overly muscular. His pale skin seemed almost too smooth for a warrior, but his cold, emotionless eyes told a different story. He was a sniper. He didn't need to be seen to be deadly. A single shot from him could end a battle before it even started. Next was Lieutenant Samara Jane. She was small but powerful, her short hair framed by a face that seemed both kind and terrifying. She was a combat engineer, but not the kind who just fixed things. Samara knew how to break things too. She could build explosive devices and traps that could level a city or lay waste to an entire army. The Trethul wouldn't be able to outsmart her. They'd never know what hit them. Jackson Iron Jaw Briggs followed behind Samara. He was a wall of muscle, towering over the others like a living tank. His arms were mechanical, the result of an accident in his past that left him without natural limbs. But the metal arms he now wore were stronger than anything any living species could produce. They could crush bone, smash walls, and tear through metal with ease. He was the brute force of the group, and no Trethul would want to face him in hand-to-hand combat. Finally, the last human to enter the room was a figure that seemed completely out of place. He was tall and thin, with gaunt features and dark, hollow eyes. There was nothing menacing about him at first glance. He didn't have the physical presence of Ironjaw or the deadly calm of Alexei, but his presence alone made the other species uneasy. His name was Dr. Finch. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a fighter. But he was dangerous in a way no one could truly understand. His mind worked differently from anyone else's. He had studied death in all its forms, and he knew exactly how to bring it when needed. He carried no weapons, but his knowledge was his weapon. He was a master of psychological warfare, manipulating minds, creating confusion, and exploiting weaknesses. He could turn any battlefield into a living nightmare for his enemies. The Xrithol wouldn't know what hit them. The council stared at the humans. They were clearly different from the soldiers they were used to. They didn't look like traditional warriors, but there was something about them. Something cold and terrifying. The leader of the Trelax stepped forward, his 3 eyes scanning the humans with open disbelief. These are your warriors. They are small, fragile, even. Valeria's cold smile never faltered. She stepped forward, meeting the Trelax leader's gaze directly. We're not here to impress you. We're here to kill the Xrithol. Her words were sharp and direct. She wasn't trying to win them over. She was making a promise. The Dravket strategist, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. You humans, you fight without honor. You fight without rules. What makes you think you're fit for this war? Valeria's smile widened, her eyes glinting with something dangerous. Honor, rules, those don't win wars. Survival does, and we know how to survive. At that, there was a brief silence in the room, broken only by the sound of the crew's boots as they stood in perfect formation behind their captain. The message was clear. They weren't here to negotiate, and they certainly weren't here to play by anyone else's rules. I'll tell you this, Valeria continued, her voice steady. The Xrithol are a predator species. They see weakness, and they strike. But that's where they make their mistake. Because we, humanity, are predators too, and we don't fear anything that bleeds. The Trelax leader and the Dravket strategist exchanged nervous glances. There was something unsettling about the humans, something about the way they spoke with absolute certainty, without a hint of hesitation. Maybe they weren't what the council had expected, but they were exactly what the galaxy needed. The humans, for all their flaws and rough edges, understood one thing better than anyone. War. It wasn't about strategy, politics, or rules. It was about killing the enemy before they could kill you. And if the Xrithol had one weakness, it was that they underestimated their prey. The human crew didn't need approval. They didn't need recognition. They simply needed to be told where to strike. We'll prepare for the mission, Valeria said, turning on her heel and heading for the door. Time is running out. The council representatives watched them leave in stunned silence. The humans didn't care about protocol. They didn't care about respect or honor. They only cared about one thing: winning. The Xrithol might have been a terrifying force, but humanity was a force of its own. The council might not have understood it yet, but they were about to. The council had no idea what they were about to witness. The humans were assigned their first mission, a small outpost on the edge of Xrithol territory. The council wasn't sure what they hoped to accomplish. They didn't expect the humans to win, but they thought they might be able to buy some time. The Xrithol were relentless, but the humans had a reputation for surprising everyone. The mission was simple on paper: defend the outpost, gather information, and assess the Xrithol threat. Easy for most armies, but for the humans, it was just another day at the office. Captain Valeria Kane stood at the head of the table in the command center of the human ship. Her crew was already preparing for what was coming. Samara Jane ran through the plans for setting up explosives and traps. Alexei Markov checked his sniper rifle, testing its weight and balance, making sure everything was in place. Jackson Adoranjaw Briggs sat quietly, sharpening his mechanical fists. Dr. Finch wasn't worried about weapons. He was more concerned with the psychological aspects of the mission, the fear that Xrethul would try to instill, the panic they might sow. He already had a plan for that. He always had a plan. "I want everyone ready," Valeria said, her voice calm but firm. "This won't be easy, but we've faced worse. Let's give them something to remember." The crew nodded, each one with their own thoughts. For them, there was no room for fear, only focus. The Xrethul might have been terrifying, but they weren't invincible. The ambush. The humans landed at the outpost just as the sun was setting. The atmosphere was thick with tension. The Xrethul had been spotted in the area, and everyone knew what that meant. They didn't waste time. They didn't show mercy. The outpost wasn't much, just a few buildings and a small communication tower, but it was strategic. If the humans could hold it, they could stop the Xrethul from advancing further. As they disembarked from the ship, the ground beneath their feet felt different. The air was heavy, and there was an eerie silence. It was as if the world was holding its breath. The humans immediately set up their defensive positions. Samara went straight to work setting traps around the perimeter, while Alexei climbed to a high vantage point to scan the area with his long-range rifle. Valeria coordinated the defense, ensuring every angle was covered, every blind spot identified. Iron Jaw stood guard, his mechanical arms ready to smash anything that came too close. Dr. Finch, as always, kept to the back, his sharp eyes watching everything unfold. He didn't need to be on the front lines. His mind was the weapon, and he was already planning his next move. The waiting was the hardest part. The Xrethul had a terrifying way of making their enemies wait. They would watch from the shadows, letting their prey grow nervous, letting the tension build. It was a psychological tactic, a way to weaken their enemies before the fight even began. But the humans weren't easily broken. They knew the enemy was out there, just waiting for the right moment to strike. They weren't afraid. They were ready. And then it came. A sudden scream echoed across the field, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. The Xrethul had arrived. The battle begins. The first wave of Xrethul hit like a storm, swarming from the trees and the hills. They were huge, towering insect-like creatures with sharp, jagged claws and thick, armored skin. Their numbers were overwhelming, but the humans had a plan. Alexei fired first. From his elevated position, he picked off the first Xrethul, a leader by the looks of it, with a single shot. The bullet pierced its skull, dropping it without a sound. But there was no time to celebrate. As soon as the first Xrethul fell, the rest charged. There were too many to count, each one moving with deadly intent, roaring as they advanced. Samara didn't hesitate. She hit a button on her wristpad, and the ground around the outpost erupted in explosions. Landmines, tripwires, and hidden traps tore through the advancing Xrethul, shredding their ranks. The creatures screamed in pain, but their numbers didn't falter. They kept coming. Valeria took command, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Form up. Keep them at bay." Ironjaw stepped forward, meeting the first wave head-on. His mechanical fists crushed the first Xrethul that came near him, breaking its armor like it was made of paper. He didn't stop. Another Xrethul lunged at him with a jagged claw, but Ironjaw caught it mid-air and snapped its neck with a single twist. The humans fought with precision. Alexei's rifle never missed. Samara kept setting traps, each one more deadly than the last. Dr. Finch stayed in the shadows, watching, observing. He had a different kind of battle to fight. And then it happened. The Xrethul adapted. They realized their normal tactics weren't working. They couldn't overwhelm the humans with brute force alone. Suddenly, the Xrethul began to spread out, circling the humans, trying to flank them. It was a coordinated effort, and the humans could feel it. "We're being surrounded," Valeria said, her voice low and calm. "Keep your positions." But the Xrethul were smarter than they had thought. They weren't just strong. They were quick learners. And now, they were trying to close in from all sides. The turning point. It seemed like the humans were about to be overwhelmed. But then, something shifted. Dr. Finch emerged from the shadows, a small device in his hand. It wasn't a weapon. It was something far more dangerous. It was a signal jammer. With a flick of a switch, Finch activated the device, and a strange, high-pitched noise filled the air. The HFY paused. Their movements slowed. They seemed confused, disoriented. Finch's smile was almost invisible as he watched the chaos unfold. Their hive mind is their strength, but it's also their weakness. Without communication, they're just animals. The humans took advantage of the opening. Alexei picked off more of the disoriented HFY, his shots finding the weak points in their armor. Samara set more traps, her hands moving quickly and precisely, creating deadly zones that the HFY couldn't avoid. Iron Jaw charged into the fray, smashing through the confused HFY like a wrecking ball. With every blow, another one fell, its body crashing to the ground. Valeria led the charge, her blade cutting through anything that came too close. She didn't hesitate. She didn't give them a chance to fight back. The humans were finally starting to push the HFY back, and they weren't going to stop until every last one of them was dead. The aftermath. The battle didn't last long, but it felt like a lifetime. By the time the last HFY fell, the ground around the outpost was littered with bodies. The humans stood, covered in blood, sweat, and dirt, but their mission was far from over. They had won the first battle, but this was just the beginning. The HFY were not going to stop, and the humans knew it. Alexei lowered his rifle, scanning the horizon for any more threats. Samara wiped the sweat from her forehead and checked the traps to make sure no HFY were left behind. Iron Jaw stood tall, his fists still covered in the green blood of their enemies. Valeria surveyed the scene, her face hard and cold. She had led them to victory, but she wasn't celebrating. There was too much work left to do. "We've got their attention now," she said, her voice steady. "But the real fight is coming." Dr. Finch, his face expressionless, nodded in agreement. "We've only just started." The victory at the outpost had been hard won, but it wasn't enough to slow the HFY. The humans had expected that. It was only the beginning. But what they hadn't anticipated was just how quickly the HFY would adapt. It was as if the creatures were learning, evolving with each battle. The humans had become their new target, and their relentless pursuit showed no signs of stopping. Captain Valeria Kane paced back and forth inside the command center, her mind racing. The HFY hadn't just attacked, they had begun to organize, to think strategically. It was no longer just a battle of brute strength. The HFY had started using tactics, circling their prey, testing their weaknesses. It was only a matter of time before they figured out how to defeat the humans. The humans had made a deadly enemy, but they also knew how to turn the tide. "We've held the line, but for how long?" Samara Jane asked as she worked over the maps, studying the new HFY movements. "They're getting smarter," Valeria replied, stopping in her tracks. "And that's what scares me. If they keep adapting like this, we could find ourselves facing an enemy we can't defeat the same way twice." Alexei Markov was sitting at his sniper post, looking through his high-powered scope. "They're pushing from the east. A large force, and it's moving fast. They're not wasting time anymore." "Perfect," Valeria muttered, a tight smile creeping onto her face. "They want to come to us. Let's give them a welcoming party they won't forget." The HFY's unstoppable march. The HFY had regrouped, reinforcing their forces. It wasn't just one or two groups anymore. It was an entire swarm of them. And they were angry. They weren't just attacking the humans' outpost. They were tearing through nearby towns, hoping to break the humans' will to fight. They knew that if they couldn't destroy the humans' resolve, they would never be able to wipe them out. But what they didn't understand was how the humans fought. They weren't like the Trelax or the Dravket. The humans didn't give up. They didn't retreat in the face of danger. They only moved forward. Every loss fueled their drive to win, and every victory only made them stronger. "Get the traps set up," Samara ordered, slinging her pack over her shoulder. "I'll rig the perimeter, and we'll use the terrain to our advantage." Ironjaw Briggs stood up, cracking his knuckles with a mechanical hiss. "I'll handle any that come too close. You just make sure they don't get past me." His eyes gleamed with excitement. He didn't need any special motivation to fight. The idea of smashing enemies was enough. With a determined grunt, she climbed onto the beast's back, using the chaos around her to her advantage. She reached for the Karaxar's exposed neck, the weak spot she had noticed earlier. With a sharp twist, she drove her blade deep into its throat. The beast let out a deafening roar as it crumpled to the ground, finally defeated. The battlefield fell silent. The aftermath. For a moment, no one moved. The humans stood over the fallen Karaxar, breathing heavily. Their bodies were battered, but their spirits were unbroken. They had faced the tipping point, and they had come out on top, but they knew that this wasn't the end. The Xrathul were still out there, and they would be back. Valeria wiped the blood from her blade and turned to her team. "This is only the beginning. We've proven that we can take them down. Now we need to make sure they never rise again." The last battle had taken its toll on the humans. They had fought hard, defeating the Karaxar, but the Xrathul were relentless. They had already launched a counterattack, pushing the humans back toward their base. The humans knew that this was no longer just a battle for survival. It was a fight for everything they had worked for. If they failed here, they would lose the war. Captain Valeria Kane stood outside the command center, watching as the first of the Xrathul forces appeared on the horizon. Her eyes narrowed, her mind already calculating their next move. This was the moment they had been preparing for. The tipping point had passed, and now there was no turning back. She turned to face her team. Samara Jane, Alexei Markov, Ironjaw Briggs, and Dr. Finch were all gathered around her. They had been through a lot together, more than any team should have to endure, but they were still standing. They had made it this far, and they weren't about to give up now. "This is it," Valeria said, her voice firm. "The last stand. We hold this position, or we lose everything. We fight until the last breath." Samara nodded, her fingers already working through the preparations. She checked her explosives one more time, making sure everything was in place. She wasn't scared. She had faced down the worst the universe could throw at her, and this would be no different. Alexei's rifle gleamed in the low light as he examined it, running a finger along the barrel. His steady hands were all too familiar with the weight of battle. He had fought in countless skirmishes, but this time it felt different. This was their final chance to stop the Xrathul from overrunning their home. There was no more room for failure. Ironjaw stood with his fists clenched, his mechanical arms humming with energy. He wasn't worried about the fight. He was looking forward to it. Nothing thrilled him more than the sound of his fists meeting enemy armor. He didn't care if it was one enemy or 100. If they wanted to bring the fight, he was ready. Dr. Finch, calm as ever, stood quietly by. "We've pushed them back before," he said softly, looking at Valeria. "But this time, we need a plan that will force them to break, not just halt them. We can't keep playing defense." Valeria glanced at him, her eyes hard. "We won't just defend. Finch, we'll end this." The Xrathul arrive. The ground trembled as the Xrathul forces closed in. They had learned from their previous defeats. This time, they weren't going to make the same mistakes. They had brought everything with them, their full might, their war machines, and their bloodthirsty warriors. The humans were cornered, their resources dwindling, but the Xrathul didn't care. They were hungry for destruction. "Get into position," Valeria ordered. She didn't need to say more. The team was ready. They had fought side by side in countless battles, and they knew what to do. Alexei took his spot atop a nearby ridge, his sniper rifle in hand, scanning the battlefield with eagle eyes. I've got a good view. They're coming from the east and west. We'll need to focus on the center. Samara crouched beside the perimeter, ready to activate the traps. She had designed these specifically to buy them time, to create chaos among the Xrithal ranks. She knew that if she could disrupt their formations, they would falter even for a moment. That moment could make all the difference. Ironjaw stood at the front, towering over everyone else, fists crackling with energy. He was ready to charge at the first wave of Xrithal, eager to slam into them with everything he had. Dr. Finch remained at the back, his eyes constantly shifting between his team and the advancing Xrithal. He wasn't worried about physical combat. His role was far more strategic. It was his mind that had won them battles before, and this time, it would be the difference between life and death. The first wave of Xrithal charged. Screeches and roars filled the air as they surged toward the human defenses. But this time, the humans were ready. The battle begins. The battle erupted into chaos. The Xrithal came at them with everything they had. Their insect-like bodies moved with speed and precision, and their weapons clashed against the humans' defenses. Samara activated her traps, sending explosions ripping through the enemy ranks. The ground shook as Xrithal warriors were tossed into the air, their bodies twisted and mangled by the force of the blast. "Keep it up, Samara," Valeria yelled, rallying her team. "Don't let them get close." Alexei fired his first shot, picking off a Xrithal warrior from a distance. His bullets found their mark, each one a clean kill, but the enemies were too many. The battle was moving faster than anyone could have anticipated. Ironjaw charged forward, his massive mechanical fists slamming into the first wave of Xrithal. His strikes were devastating, each blow breaking through their thick armor with ease. A Xrithal tried to claw at him, but Ironjaw grabbed its arm and tore it off, tossing it aside like a ragdoll. He didn't stop. He never stopped. His fists kept swinging, smashing through the Xrithal ranks. Dr. Finch was watching the battlefield carefully. "They're learning from us," he said, almost to himself. "They're adapting. They won't fall for the same tricks twice." Valeria's eyes narrowed as she saw the shift in the enemy's behavior. The Xrithal were regrouping, their commanders issuing orders. The humans had been prepared for a frontal assault, but now the enemy was beginning to flank them. "They're splitting up," Valeria shouted. "Get ready for a two-pronged attack." Alexei adjusted his position, quickly targeting the Xrithal flanking from the east. He picked them off one by one, his aim steady and true. But even his incredible skill couldn't stop the sheer number of enemies closing in on them. The fight gets tougher. The Xrithal were relentless. As soon as one wave fell, another took its place. The humans were beginning to tire. Ironjaw's movements slowed as he kept taking down one Xrithal after another. Samara was running low on explosives, and her traps were becoming less effective as the Xrithal adapted to her tactics. Valeria stood tall, her blade slashing through Xrithal after Xrithal, but even she could feel the pressure mounting. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and cornered. She knew they couldn't keep fighting this way for much longer. Something had to change. Dr. Finch looked at the battlefield, and then at Valeria. "We need a diversion," he said urgently. "We can't win this by holding them off. We need to force them to retreat." Valeria nodded. "I've got an idea." She turned to Ironjaw. "You're going to draw their attention. You're going to make sure they focus on you." Ironjaw grinned. "Sounds like fun." Valeria quickly gathered the team. "We'll hit them from both sides while Ironjaw keeps them busy. He'll give us the opening we need to strike at their command center. Once we break their leadership, they'll scatter." Alexei raised an eyebrow. "And how do we plan on breaking their command?" "I have something in mind," Valeria said with a sly grin. "The final push." Ironjaw charged straight into the Xrithal horde, roaring in defiance. The Xrithal shifted their focus to him, throwing themselves at his massive form. With every swing of his fists, another Xrithal was sent flying, but Ironjaw didn't slow down. He was their distraction, the wrecking ball that would keep the enemy's attention fixed on him. Meanwhile, Valeria, Alexei, Samara, and Finch moved quickly, using the chaos Iron Jaw created to slip past the enemy lines. They made their way to the Truthful Command Center, hidden deep behind the lines. This was their last chance to strike. Valeria led the way, her blade flashing, as she cut through the last of the Truthful stragglers. Alexei provided cover, picking off any enemies who tried to stop them. Samara placed more traps as they moved, making sure that no reinforcements could stop their progress. Dr. Finch kept his eyes on the larger battlefield, watching for signs of weakness in the Truthful ranks. Finally, they reached the command center. "Now," Valeria shouted. Samara activated the explosive charges, sending a deafening blast into the command center. The Truthful leadership, caught by surprise, was thrown into chaos. The entire battlefield shifted as their organized forces crumbled. Iron Jaw's roar could be heard in the distance, a sound of triumph as the Truthful leaders fell. The victorious battle was over, and the Truthful forces had been defeated. But the cost had been high. The humans had fought harder than ever before, and they had emerged victorious. But the victory came at a price. The battlefield was littered with the remains of both sides, and the stench of destruction filled the air. It was a haunting reminder of the war they had fought, and the sacrifices they had made. Captain Valeria Kane stood at the edge of the battlefield, her armor dented and scorched, her face streaked with dirt and blood. She looked out over the chaos that had once been a forest, now scorched and torn apart by the conflict. The Truthful were no longer a threat, but the scars they had left behind would remain forever. Her team, Samara Jane, Alexei Markov, Iron Jaw Briggs, and Dr. Finch, gathered around her. They were all battered, bruised, and exhausted, but they were alive. They had survived. They had won. "This is it," Valeria said quietly, her voice heavy with the weight of what they had just accomplished. "We've done it. We've defeated the Truthful." But even as the words left her mouth, she knew it wasn't over. The battle might be won, but the war was far from finished. There would be more enemies, more battles to fight. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and the humans had only scratched the surface of what lay ahead. The wounds of war. Despite the victory, the humans had paid a heavy price. The number of soldiers who had fallen in battle was far too great, and the loss was felt deeply. Valeria, as the leader, took the burden of each fallen comrade personally. Every death weighed on her heart, a reminder of her responsibility to the people she led. Iron Jaw Briggs was the first to speak after a long silence. His voice was a deep rumble, full of both relief and sorrow. "We've won, but it feels like something's missing," he said, his gaze distant. "We've killed hundreds of Truthful, but it still feels like we lost something we can't get back." Valeria nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Winning a battle was one thing, but the aftermath, the quiet, the emptiness left behind by those who had given their lives, was another. "I know," she replied softly. "But we didn't just win this for us. We won it for them, for everyone we've lost." Samara Jane, always the practical one, wiped sweat from her brow and looked at Valeria. "We fought well, but this war isn't over. We've stopped the Truthful for now, but who's to say someone else won't rise up in their place?" Alexei Markov, ever the strategist, glanced at the horizon, his expression unreadable. "She's right. This was a victory, but it wasn't a final one. We've only delayed the inevitable." Valeria took a deep breath, turning her gaze from the wreckage to her team. "I know," she said firmly, "but we've proven something today. We've shown that no matter how many times they come at us, we will fight back. We're not just survivors, we're fighters." The team stood together, a moment of quiet reflection before the reality of their situation hit them again. The war might not be over, but they had proven that they could stand up to any enemy, no matter how powerful. The human spirit. As the days passed and the dust began to settle, the humans started rebuilding. They worked tirelessly to restore their outposts, their homes, and their way of life. The cost of the war was still fresh in everyone's minds, but they knew they had to keep moving forward. The victory over the HFY had proven their strength, but now it was time to prove their resilience. Valeria found herself in a quiet moment, standing on the edge of a new settlement that had begun to take shape. The stars above her were clear, and the night was peaceful. For a moment, she let herself feel the calm after the storm, but it didn't last long. She could still feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. She wasn't the only one who felt it. Dr. Finch approached, his face tired but determined. "You did it, Valeria," he said quietly, standing next to her. "You led them to victory." Valeria shook her head, a small smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "I didn't do it alone. We all did. This team. It's not just a group of soldiers. It's a family." Finch gave a small chuckle, the corners of his eyes crinkling with a rare smile. "You've got a funny way of showing it, but I suppose you're right. We're all in this together." "You've been more than just a doctor," Valeria said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "You've been a strategist, a friend. You've kept us together when we were ready to fall apart." Finch's smile faded as he looked out at the settlement. "We've been through a lot. I just hope we're ready for what comes next. The HFY were only the beginning of a new legend." As the humans continued to rebuild, stories of their victory spread throughout the galaxy. Tales of their courage, their sacrifice, and their unwavering resolve became legends. Valeria, Alexei, Samara, Ironjaw, and Finch became symbols of human strength, heroes who had stood against the greatest threat the galaxy had ever known and come out victorious. But for Valeria, the legend wasn't about her. It wasn't about the team. It was about the people they fought for, the ones who hadn't made it, the ones who had fallen in battle. They would never be forgotten, and their sacrifice would live on in the hearts of every human who fought to protect their home. "You know, one day, someone will write a book about us," Alexei said with a half-smile, his voice light as they sat around the fire, exhausted but content. "And I bet they'll call it The Legend of the Last Stand." "I'd rather they remember the people we fought for," Valeria replied quietly. "The real heroes aren't the ones who survived. They're the ones who gave everything so that we could." Samara nodded, looking up at the stars. "We'll keep fighting," she said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "We've shown the galaxy what humans can do. And no matter what comes next, we'll always stand together." Ironjaw grinned, slapping his massive metal hands together. "I don't know about legends, but I'm ready for the next fight. Bring it on." Valeria smiled, looking at each member of her team. "You're right. We're ready. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. And this time, we'll be ready." A new threat on the horizon. As the humans rebuilt, they knew the peace they had fought so hard for was fragile. News came from distant planets of new threats rising, new forces who had seen the humans' strength and sought to challenge it. But instead of fear, there was resolve. The humans weren't done yet. The battles they had fought had forged them into something stronger than ever before. Alexei stood at the front of a new human outpost, looking out over the horizon. He saw the glimmers of new battles, new enemies, and new challenges ahead, but he also saw something else. The human spirit, unbroken and unyielding. "I don't know what's next," he said, turning to Valeria. "But I know one thing. We'll be ready." Valeria's eyes were hard with determination, but there was something else in her gaze. Hope. Hope that, no matter what the future held, the legend of what they had achieved would live on. And as long as they stood together, there was no enemy too powerful to defeat. "We will be," Valeria said, her voice strong and steady. "We are the legend of the last stand. And no matter what, we will never stop fighting." The legacy of the heroes. And so the legend of Valeria Kane and her team grew. Their names were spoken with awe, their bravery and resilience known across the galaxy. The galaxy's darkest hour had passed, but a new chapter was beginning. Every victory from that day forward was built on the strength and courage of those who had come before. The humans had become a symbol of hope, of survival, and of victory. And as long as the stars burned brightly in the sky, their legend would live on, inspiring future generations to stand tall, to fight for what was right, and to never give up. The galaxy would never forget the human spirit. The fight wasn't over, but they were ready. And that, in itself, was the beginning of a new legend.